They thought America couldn't possibly replace its ships fast enough. They thought each carrier destroyed at Pearl Harbor would cripple U.S. naval power for years. But Japanese commanders were wrong, very wrong. Because when the smoke cleared, America began building aircraft carriers at a pace the world had never seen before, and Japan was stunned. December 7, 1941, the morning of the Pearl Harbor attack. Japanese aircraft had just dealt what Tokyo believed was a death blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Battleships lay shattered, cruisers were burning, and 2,400 Americans were dead. Japanese leaders toasted to victory, believing the Americans had neither the willpower nor the industrial strength to recover quickly. But there was one detail they overlooked. None of the American aircraft carriers were in port that day. The USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga were all at sea, and those ships, along with the secret construction plans already in motion back in American shipyards, would soon change the course of the entire Pacific War. To understand why Japan was so shocked, we must step back and look at the world in 1941. Japan believed that naval warfare would still be dominated by battleships, the giant floating fortresses armed with massive guns. Aircraft carriers, in their eyes, were fragile, experimental, and secondary. Even the U.S. Navy still debated whether carriers could ever replace battleships as the true kings of the sea. But America's industrial planners had already started making a gamble. Before the war even began, construction orders were placed for a new class of aircraft carriers, the Essex class. These were bigger, faster, and more powerful than anything Japan had at the time. While Japan focused on perfecting its fleet of Zero fighters and preparing daring naval strikes, American shipyards were preparing for something else entirely: mass production. And this industrial gamble was about to leave Japanese commanders in shock. Imagine being a Japanese admiral in 1942. You've just seen the stunning success at Pearl Harbor. You believe the Americans will need years to recover. Yet only months later, new carriers begin appearing, one after another, as if out of thin air. How was this possible? The answer was hidden inside America's factories, shipyards, and the sheer scale of U.S. industrial power. This is the story of how America's aircraft carrier production stunned Japan, turned the tide of the war, and revealed the true weapon of World War II. Not just planes, not just ships, but the ability to build them faster than anyone else. After Pearl Harbor, Japan believed it had secured naval dominance in the Pacific. Japanese leaders expected the United States to negotiate peace rather than face the impossible task of rebuilding its shattered fleet. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself famously warned Tokyo, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." His words would prove chillingly accurate. In the early months of 1942, the U.S. Navy was fighting desperately. Carriers like the USS Lexington, USS Yorktown, and USS Enterprise became the tip of America's spear. These floating air bases allowed the U.S. to strike back at Japan, even while much of its battleship fleet lay crippled. For the first time in naval history, battleships were no longer the deciding factor. It was aircraft carriers that controlled the seas. But here's where Japan miscalculated. Tokyo assumed America could only field a handful of carriers at a time. Japanese industry was already stretched thin by war in China and Southeast Asia. It took them years to design and build even a single large carrier. In contrast, the United States was about to unleash something the world had never witnessed: an industrial revolution applied directly to warfare. The Essex-class carriers were the centerpiece of this effort. Conceived before the war, these ships were designed to carry more planes, withstand more damage, and operate across the vast Pacific. The first of them, USS Essex, was commissioned in 1942. But she was only the beginning. American shipyards were soon laying keels for dozens more. The scale was staggering. At the Newport News shipbuilding yard in Virginia, cranes swung day and night. Welding torches lit up the night sky as entire sections of hulls were assembled like giant puzzle pieces. Across the country, workers, many,
of them women who had never before worked in factories, took on the challenge of building the WW2's new warships.
They were dubbed Rosie the Riveters and became symbols of America's home front power. Japan's admirals simply couldn't comprehend this. Their mindset was shaped by decades of tradition. Warships were unique, handcrafted marvels, built slowly and carefully. But in America, shipyards treated carriers almost like cars on an assembly line. Standardized designs meant parts could be swapped, production could be accelerated, and delays could be minimized. By mid-1942, America's gamble on carriers was already paying off. At the Battle of Coral Sea, U.S. carriers halted a Japanese advance toward Australia. Soon after, at Midway, 3 American carriers faced off against 4 Japanese carriers. In one of the most dramatic battles of the war, Japan lost 4 frontline carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. This was a devastating blow. But what truly shocked Japanese commanders was not just the loss, it was how quickly the Americans rebounded. Yorktown was lost at Midway, but even before her wreck settled on the ocean floor, shipyards back home were launching new Essex-class carriers that dwarfed Japan's capacity. For every carrier Japan could build, America could build 5. For every fighter Japan lost, American factories churned out replacements faster than they could be deployed. The numbers were no longer in Japan's favor, and their admirals knew it. This realization was creeping into Japanese high command, but the full scale of America's shipbuilding miracle had yet to be revealed. What happened next would leave Japan in absolute disbelief. By late 1942 and early 1943, the Pacific was no longer the playground of the Imperial Japanese Navy. America's industrial might was starting to tilt the balance, and Japan's commanders were beginning to feel the pressure. The Guadalcanal campaign became the first real test of this new dynamic. For 6 brutal months, the Japanese and Americans fought over a tiny island that became the pivot of the Pacific War. Japanese forces expected to grind down the Americans, but they hadn't factored in the growing pipeline of U.S. carriers arriving in the theater. The USS Saratoga, USS Enterprise, and the newly arrived USS Hornet struck repeatedly, keeping Japanese reinforcements at bay. Every time Japan sank an American carrier, another seemed to appear on the horizon. This was no coincidence. It was the result of a massive mobilization back home. While Japanese yards struggled to replace the carriers lost at Midway, American shipyards were launching Essex-class carriers one after another. It wasn't just carriers either. Smaller escort carriers, known as jeep carriers, were also being mass-produced to protect convoys and support invasions. Imagine being a Japanese admiral receiving intelligence reports. America had not just 3 or 4 carriers, but soon 10, then 20, and more still under construction. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, privately admitted that Japan could never match America's output. As one captured Japanese officer later recalled, it seemed as though every time we destroyed one ship, but the shock went beyond sheer numbers. The Essex-class carriers weren't just plentiful, they were formidable. Each one could carry nearly 100 planes, protected by thick armor and powerful anti-aircraft guns. They were floating fortresses, and their air groups, fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, could project power hundreds of miles away. The Japanese had prided themselves on their elite pilots, the famed Zero fighters, and the daring of men who had humiliated Western navies in 1941 and 1942. But by 1943, America's new Hellcats and Avengers, flying off the decks of fresh Essex carriers, were beginning to eclipse Japanese air power. The Zero was fast and nimble, but it lacked armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Against America's new planes, it was becoming obsolete. Worse still, the Japanese had no way to train new pilots fast enough to replace their losses. American carriers, on the other hand, became floating academies, rotating in fresh squadrons of newly trained aviators. What Japan had assumed was its greatest advantage, its skilled pilots, was slipping away. By the middle of 1943, Japanese commanders realized they were fighting not just against a navy, but against an entire nation's industrial machinery. America was outbuilding them, outtraining them, and soon outmaneuvering them. The vast Pacific, once dominated by the rising sun, was slowly becoming a battlefield of American steel and firepower. The tide of war was shifting, but Japan had not yet faced the full storm. The next stage would be even more devastating, as America's aircraft carrier armada grew into an unstoppable force. By late 1943, the full weight of America's aircraft carrier production was crashing down upon Japan. The Essex-class carriers were arriving so quickly that it seemed impossible to stop them. Each month, American shipyards launched yet another floating airfield, and each arrival brought with it fresh squadrons of planes and thousands of sailors. The Central Pacific Drive, Admiral Chester Nimitz's grand strategy, put this new power on full display. Operation Galvanic, the invasion of Tarawa in November 1943, was supported by no fewer than 17 carriers, fleet and escort combined. Japanese defenders were stunned. They had expected a handful of carriers at most. Instead, the skies were darkened by American planes, waves upon waves smashing fortifications and supply lines. The message was clear. America could project overwhelming air power anywhere, anytime. For the Japanese High Command, this was a nightmare realized. They had gambled everything on a war of swift, decisive victories. Now, dragged into a prolonged conflict, they were bleeding ships, aircraft, and, most crucially, trained pilots. Each time Japan launched a counterstrike, the Americans absorbed the blow, repaired their ships faster, and sent even more carriers into the fight. 1944 marked the turning point. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, America's carrier force reached its peak efficiency. 15 carriers, supported by hundreds of planes, faced off against the Japanese fleet. The result was catastrophic for Japan. More than 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in just 2 days, while American losses were minimal. The skies that once belonged to the Zero now belonged to the Hellcat. For Japanese commanders, the scale of destruction was incomprehensible. Admiral Ozawa's fleet was shattered, his pilots annihilated. In desperation, Japan began turning to inexperienced aviators, men who could barely take off and land on carriers, against highly trained American squadrons. One Japanese officer later wrote, "We no longer fought against men, we fought against factories." The deeper tragedy for Japan was that even their most advanced designs could not keep pace. New carriers like the Shinano, converted from a battleship hull, were built too slowly and deployed too late. Meanwhile, American shipyards rolled out Essex after Essex, supported by light carriers and escort carriers that multiplied the U.S. advantage. By the time American forces reached the Philippines in late 1944, the Pacific had transformed. What once was an ocean dominated by the rising sun was now a sea of American carriers. Entire task forces roamed the waters, striking Japan's positions at will, while Japanese admirals watched their navy shrink to a shadow of its former glory. The war's turning point had come. But even greater devastation awaited Japan as America prepared to bring its carrier armada closer to the home islands. The question was no longer whether Japan could hold the Pacific, it was how long they could delay the inevitable. By 1945, the U.S. Navy's carrier force had become an unstoppable juggernaut. Task Force 38, the largest carrier strike force in history, sailed directly into the waters Japan once called its own. Dozens of Essex-class carriers and their escorts now operated together in massive fleets, projecting air power on a scale the world had never imagined. The turning point came during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. Japan launched a desperate gamble, committing nearly all its remaining naval strength to one last decisive strike. Their hope was to split the American fleet and cripple the invasion of the Philippines. For days, carriers, battleships, and submarines clashed across the vast waters. But once again, it was America's aircraft carriers that decided the battle. Waves of planes swarmed Japanese battleships and carriers, crippling them before they could close in. The once mighty Musashi, one of Japan's largest battleships, was sent to the bottom by relentless carrier-based strikes. In the north, the Japanese carrier force under Admiral Ozawa was used as bait, but American pilots destroyed it almost entirely. When the smoke cleared, Japan had lost nearly all of its remaining carriers, most of its battleships, and thousands of sailors. The Imperial Navy, the pride of Japan, was no longer capable of mounting a serious challenge. Admiral Halsey would later remark that after Leyte Gulf, Japan's navy had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. And yet, America's carriers pressed even harder. As 1945 began, they moved within range of the Japanese home islands. Entire cities came under bombardment, with carrier-based aircraft pounding industrial centers, railroads, and military bases. The Japanese could do nothing to stop it. Their skies, once guarded by elite Zero pilots, were now empty, or filled with desperate kamikaze attackers who hurled themselves at the massive American fleets. But even kamikazes could not change the outcome. America's production had given it an overwhelming advantage. Dozens of carriers, hundreds of escort ships, and thousands of aircraft. Every kamikaze that struck a ship was a tragedy, but within days the vessel would be repaired, replaced, or reinforced. Japan simply could not match the pace. The resolution of this colossal struggle was now clear. The aircraft carrier had proven itself not just a weapon, but the weapon of the Pacific War. And America's ability to produce them in staggering numbers had sealed Japan's fate. By the spring of 1945, the seas around Japan bristled with American carriers. They had made the Pacific an American ocean, and Japan's dream of naval supremacy had vanished forever. The war was entering its final act, but for Japanese commanders, the realization had already struck. America's carriers, born from endless factories and shipyards, had won the war at sea. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Japan lay in ruins, not only from the atomic bombs, but from months of relentless carrier-based strikes that had reduced entire cities to rubble and shattered the empire's ability to fight. For Japanese naval commanders who survived the war, the lesson was undeniable. They had underestimated the industrial and strategic might of the United States. One Japanese admiral later admitted in post-war interviews that their intelligence had never imagined America could launch so many carriers so quickly. "We thought they could build 10, perhaps 12, he said, but not 50. In reality, the US had built over 100 carriers of all types, fleet, light, and escort, by the war's end. This was a figure that stunned even America's own allies. The twist: many of these carriers were so new that they never even saw combat. By 1945, shipyards were delivering carriers faster than the Navy could crew them. America had not only matched Japan's carrier fleet, it had built so many that victory was overproduced. The shipyards of Newport News, Brooklyn, and the West Coast kept launching warships as if the war would last forever. When peace came, dozens of completed or nearly completed carriers went straight into reserve fleets. For Japan, this reality was devastating. Their proud carrier force, which had once ruled the Pacific and launched the daring attack on Pearl Harbor, had been outbuilt, outflown, and outlasted. The very weapon they had pioneered, the aircraft carrier, had become the instrument of their defeat. And here ends the most haunting fact. While Japan's entire wartime economy struggled to build and maintain a handful of ships, America's factories built so many that they became surplus. The symbol of American strength was not just the mighty carrier sailing into Tokyo Bay, it was the quiet truth that dozens more were waiting, ready, if the war had continued. In the aftermath, Japanese generals and admirals were left in awe. They had underestimated America's industrial capacity, and that miscalculation had cost them the Pacific. It wasn't simply the courage of pilots or the skill of admirals, it was the relentless machine of production that won the war. And so, as the war closed, history recorded an extraordinary reversal. The empire that once shocked the world with its carrier fleet was itself stunned into defeat by America's overwhelming shipbuilding power. If you found this story as eye-opening as I did, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more untold World War II stories. Every week, we bring you the hidden battles, the overlooked machines, and the human stories that shaped our world. Stay tuned, because history still has secrets left to reveal.